Imagine you're Hitler in 1941, feeling pretty good about yourself. You've just rolled through most of Europe like a hot knife through butter, and now you're eyeing the Soviet Union like it's the last piece of cake at a birthday party. What could possibly go wrong? Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into one of history's most brutal reality checks. The Battle of Stalingrad. Hey there, history lovers. Before we jump into this wild ride through one of World War II's most intense battles, make sure to smash that like button if you're ready for some serious historical drama. And don't forget to hit subscribe and ring that notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss our upcoming episodes where we dive deep into the most fascinating conflicts in human history. June 22nd, 1941, started like any other day, except for the minor detail that nearly 4 million German and Axis troops decided to crash the Soviet Union's party uninvited. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to be Hitler's masterpiece, a quick knockout punch that would bring Stalin to his knees faster than you could say blitzkrieg. The German war machine rolled across the border with the confidence of a gambler on a winning streak. Hundreds of thousands of square miles fell under German control as they steamrolled through Soviet defenses. Army Group Center, led by the ambitious Fedor von Bock, charged toward Moscow like kids running toward an ice cream truck. For a moment there, it looked like Hitler's crazy plan might actually work. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely catastrophic for the Germans. You see, Hitler and his generals made a classic mistake that would make even a first-year military academy student facepalm. They forgot to check the weather forecast. More specifically, they forgot about the legendary Russian winter that had already sent Napoleon packing over a century earlier. When winter arrived, it didn't just knock on the door. It kicked it down, moved in, and started rearranging the furniture. The German advance froze solid, literally. Tanks wouldn't start, weapons jammed, and soldiers discovered that stylish Wehrmacht uniforms weren't exactly designed for temperatures that could freeze your breath mid-sentence. Fast forward to spring 1942, and Hitler was like that friend who insists on doubling down at the casino after losing big. Despite the previous year's setback, he was ready for round two with the Soviets. This time, though, he had a slightly different strategy. Instead of going straight for Moscow again, he decided to grab the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus region. Now, this wasn't entirely crazy thinking. Oil was the lifeblood of any modern army, and the Germans were running shorter on fuel than a teenager's car at the end of the month. The Caucasus region around Baku produced about 80% of Soviet oil, so capturing it would be like stealing your opponent's gas tank while filling up your own. But Hitler, being Hitler, couldn't resist adding a little extra spice to the plan. There was this city on the Volga River that had recently been renamed after his nemesis Stalin. Originally called Volgograd, it was now Stalingrad, and the propaganda value of capturing a city named after the Soviet leader was too tempting for Hitler to ignore. Think about it. Imagine the headlines if Nazi flags were flying over Stalingrad. It would be like scoring a touchdown and doing a victory dance on your opponent's logo at midfield. The psychological impact would be enormous, or so Hitler thought. Enter Friedrich Paulus, a man who was about to become either a hero or a cautionary tale, depending on how you look at it. When Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau decided to go for a morning jog in sub-zero temperatures and promptly died of a stroke, seriously, what was he thinking? Paulus got promoted to command the mighty Sixth Army. Now, Paulus was an interesting character. Unlike many of his Nazi colleagues, he wasn't completely obsessed with the whole master race ideology. In fact, one of his first acts was to reverse some of his predecessors' more brutal orders regarding Soviet civilians. He was more of a traditional military man than a fanatical Nazi, which would later prove both a blessing and a curse. The Sixth Army itself was nothing to sneeze at. 285,000 men with tanks, artillery, and enough firepower to level a small country. They had earned their reputation during the successful campaigns in France and the Low Countries, where they had performed like a well-oiled machine. Now they were ready to add the Soviet Union to their list of conquered territories. Hitler's 1942 summer offensive, dubbed Case Blue, was supposed to be the knockout punch that would finally bring the Soviet Union to its knees. On paper, it looked brilliant. Strike toward the oil fields while simultaneously capturing Stalingrad to cut Soviet supply lines and deliver a massive psychological blow. But you know what they say about the best-laid plans. They often meet reality and get punched in the face. The German army was already stretched thinner than pizza dough, supply lines were longer than a Monday morning, and the Soviets were proving to be far more resilient than anyone had expected. The offensive began on June 28, 1942, with Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army charging eastward like cavalry in the old days, except with tanks instead of horses. Initially, everything went according to plan. The Germans made rapid advances, captured territory, and things looked rosy. But then Hitler did what Hitler did best. He changed his mind at the worst possible moment. Instead of concentrating his forces for maximum impact, he decided to split them up. Some went south toward the oil fields, others went east toward Stalingrad. It was like trying to catch two rabbits at once. Usually, you end up catching neither. By late August 1942, Paulus and his 6th Army were approaching Stalingrad, probably feeling pretty confident about their chances. After all, they had been steamrolling Soviet resistance for months. How hard could it be to capture one city? Famous last words, right? The city that awaited them wasn't just any city. It was about to become the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. Stalingrad stretched along the western bank of the Volga River for about 30 miles. A sprawling industrial center filled with factories, workers' housing, and enough concrete and steel to turn every street corner into a fortress. Stalin, meanwhile, was watching the German advance with growing alarm. This wasn't just about losing another city. This was about losing the city that bore his name. Imagine if someone tried to capture a city named after you. You'd probably take it personally too. Stalin's response was typically Stalin-esque, brutal and uncompromising. He issued Order 227, better known as "Not One Step Back." This wasn't just a motivational slogan. It was a death sentence for anyone who retreated without permission. Soviet soldiers found themselves caught between German bullets in front and Soviet machine guns behind them. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. When the German assault on Stalingrad began in earnest, both sides probably thought it would be over relatively quickly. The Germans had their superior training, equipment, and air support. The Soviets had their determination, knowledge of the terrain, and the advantage of fighting for their homeland. What neither side fully understood was that they were about to engage in a type of warfare that would make previous battles look like gentlemanly duels. Urban warfare is a completely different beast from fighting in open fields. Every building becomes a fortress, every street a killing zone, and every window a potential sniper's nest. The Luftwaffe began by trying to bomb Stalingrad into submission, turning much of the city into rubble. This seemed like a good idea at first. After all, how can you defend a pile of ruins? But the joke was on the Germans, because ruins make excellent defensive positions. Every pile of rubble became a bunker, every destroyed building a maze of firing positions. Soviet soldiers, many of them fresh recruits who had never seen combat before, found themselves thrust into what can only be described as hell on earth. Buildings collapsed around them, artillery shells rained down constantly, and the average life expectancy of a new arrival was measured in hours, not days. One of the most incredible stories from the battle involves a simple grain elevator that became the site of an epic last stand. A small group of Soviet soldiers, led by a sergeant named Andrei Kozyainov, barricaded themselves inside this concrete structure and decided to make the Germans pay for every inch. For weeks, this tiny garrison held off repeated German attacks. They had limited ammunition, dwindling food supplies, and no hope of reinforcement, but they kept fighting. The Germans threw everything they had at the elevator: artillery, airstrikes, infantry assaults, but the stubborn defenders just wouldn't give up. The psychological impact of this small group's resistance was enormous. If a handful of Soviet soldiers could hold up an entire German division for weeks, what did that say about German invincibility? These weren't elite troops or fanatical communists. They were ordinary guys who decided they'd rather die fighting than surrender. When the elevator finally fell, the Germans found only a few survivors among the defenders. But the damage was done. Not just to the building, but to German morale and their timeline for capturing the city. Urban warfare breeds snipers like swamps breed mosquitoes, and Stalingrad became a sniper's paradise. The rubble-strewn landscape provided countless hiding spots, and both sides quickly learned that showing yourself in the open was a fast way to meet your maker. Soviet snipers became legends during the battle, picking off German officers and specialists with deadly precision. Every time a German soldier peeked around a corner or stood up too tall, he risked becoming another statistic. The psychological pressure was enormous. Imagine knowing that somewhere out there, someone was watching you through a scope, waiting for you to make one wrong move. The Germans responded by bringing in their own expert marksmen, turning parts of Stalingrad into a deadly game of hide-and-seek, played with rifles. Buildings became hunting grounds, with snipers stalking each other through the ruins like deadly game of cat and mouse. This sniper war within a war added another layer of terror to an already nightmarish situation. Soldiers on both sides developed an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, knowing that death could come from any direction at any moment. While the infantry were slugging it out in the ruins, both armies were facing a problem that would ultimately prove decisive: supplies. Fighting a massive battle is expensive in terms of ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies, and Stalingrad was consuming resources at a frightening rate. The Germans were particularly struggling. Their supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles through hostile territory, and every truck or train that brought supplies to the front was a target for Soviet partisans and air attacks. Fuel shortages became so severe that some German units had to abandon perfectly good tanks simply because they couldn't fill the gas tanks. The Soviets had their own supply problems, but they had one crucial advantage: the Volga River. Every night, boats would cross the river under cover of darkness, bringing fresh troops, ammunition, and supplies to the defenders. It was dangerous work, with German artillery constantly targeting the river crossings, but it kept the defense alive. This supply situation created a vicious cycle for the Germans. The longer the battle dragged on, the more supplies they consumed, which made their overall situation worse, which made the battle take even longer. It was like being caught in quicksand. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. While the Germans were grinding themselves to pieces in Stalingrad's ruins, the Soviet High Command was cooking up something special. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's best general, was planning a counter-offensive that would make the Germans wish they had never heard of Stalingrad. Operation Uranus, named after the Greek god who was supposedly the grandfather of Mars, the god of war, was designed to be the ultimate encirclement. Instead of trying to push the Germans out of Stalingrad directly, the Soviets would attack the weaker Romanian and Hungarian units, protecting the German flanks, then sweep around to surround the entire Sixth Army. The plan was audacious, requiring precise timing and massive resources. Nearly 1 million Soviet troops were assembled for the operation, along with thousands of tanks and a rebuilt air force. Keeping this massive build-up secret from German intelligence was a challenge in itself. On November 19, 1942, the hammer fell. Soviet forces smashed through the Axis lines north and south of Stalingrad like a sledgehammer through glass. Within days, they had linked up west of the city, trapping Paulus and his entire Sixth Army in what the Germans would call the cauldron. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that you're completely surrounded by enemies, hundreds of miles from friendly forces, with winter coming and supplies running low. That was the situation facing the German Sixth Army in late November 1942. Paulus found himself commanding roughly 250,000 men, trapped in a pocket around Stalingrad, with Soviet forces controlling all the escape routes. His options were limited: try to break out immediately, dig in and wait for rescue, or surrender. Given Hitler's personality, surrender wasn't really an option. The Führer, predictably, ordered Paulus to hold his position at all costs. No retreat, no surrender, just hold on until relief arrived. This decision would doom the Sixth Army, but Hitler was convinced that his forces could hold out indefinitely if supplied by air. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, confidently assured Hitler that his air force could keep the trapped army supplied. After all, they had managed smaller airlift operations before. How hard could it be to supply 250,000 men in the middle of winter while under constant enemy fire? The answer was very hard indeed. The German airlift operation was doomed from the start, though nobody wanted to admit it at the time. The Luftwaffe promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the trapped army, but this was like promising to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. First, the Germans didn't have enough transport aircraft for such a massive operation. Most of their planes were bombers pressed into cargo service, which was like using a sports car to move furniture. Technically possible, but not very efficient. Second, the weather was absolutely terrible. Winter storms grounded aircraft for days at a time, and when planes could fly, they faced Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Many German transport planes were shot down or crashed in the harsh conditions. Third, the airfields inside the pocket were constantly under attack. Soviet artillery and aircraft targeted these strips relentlessly, making takeoffs and landings extremely dangerous. Some days, more supplies were destroyed on the ground than were successfully delivered. The reality was that the airlift delivered maybe 100 tons per day on a good day, and often much less. The trapped army needed 500 tons minimum just to survive, let alone fight effectively. It was mathematics that even Hitler couldn't argue with, though he certainly tried. Christmas 1942 in Stalingrad was probably the most depressing holiday celebration in military history. German soldiers huddled in frozen bunkers, sharing meager rations and trying to stay warm, while Soviet artillery shells provided a deadly percussion section to their carols. One German soldier wrote in his diary about a comrade who insisted on finishing a Christmas carol before going on duty, only to be killed by a mortar shell minutes later. These men were slowly starving and freezing to death, clinging to memories of home while trapped in a concrete hell. The contrast between their situation and normal Christmas celebrations back in Germany must have been heartbreaking. Instead of warm homes and family dinners, they had rubble and fear. Instead of Christmas presents, they had ammunition shortages and frostbite. Soviet soldiers, meanwhile, were preparing their own kind of Christmas present for the Germans. A series of attacks designed to squeeze the pocket even smaller. For them, every day that passed brought them closer to victory and brought the invaders closer to defeat. As the siege dragged on, the Germans inside the pocket began facing problems that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Fresh water became so scarce that soldiers had to venture to the frozen Volga River to collect ice, often under enemy fire. In one of the war's most disturbing chapters, some German units began using Soviet orphans, children as young as 5 or 6, to collect water from the river. They would promise these kids chocolate or other treats in exchange for this deadly service. It was a sign of how desperate the situation had become when grown soldiers had to rely on children to fetch water. Food became another critical issue. The official rations were cut again and again until soldiers were receiving barely enough calories to stay alive, let alone fight effectively. Some units began eating their horses, then moved on to anything else they could find that might be edible. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Wounded soldiers often had to wait days for treatment, and many died from injuries that could have been easily treated under normal circumstances. The field hospitals became overcrowded morgues where the living lay next to the dead. By January 1943, the situation inside the Stalingrad pocket had become hopeless, though Hitler still refused to acknowledge reality. The Sixth Army was now squeezed into an area barely a few miles across, constantly under artillery bombardment, with no hope of rescue or resupply. Soviet forces launched their final offensive on January 10th, systematically crushing the remaining German resistance. What had once been a proud army was now a collection of starving, frozen men who could barely hold their weapons, let alone fight effectively. On January 30th, Hitler made a gesture that was either supremely cynical or completely delusional. He promoted Paulus to field marshal. The message was clear. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive, so Paulus was expected to either achieve a miracle or die trying. Paulus, however, had seen enough of his men die for Hitler's delusions. On January 31st, 1943, he surrendered himself and his staff to Soviet forces. The remaining German units continued fighting for another 2 days before they too gave up. When the smoke finally cleared over Stalingrad, the cost was staggering. Approximately 2 million people, soldiers and civilians combined, had become casualties in this single battle. The German Sixth Army, once a proud fighting force of nearly 300,000 men, was completely destroyed. Only about 90,000 Germans were taken prisoner, and most of them would never see home again. Paulus himself survived Soviet captivity and was released in 1953, but he found himself in East Germany, which had become a Soviet ally. The man who had once commanded Hitler's elite army finished his days as a supporter of the communist government that had defeated him. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became the turning point of the war. After years of defeats and retreats, they had finally proven they could not just stop the German war machine, but destroy it. The victory boosted Soviet morale and proved to the world that Nazi Germany could be beaten. For Germany, Stalingrad was the beginning of the end. The loss of an entire army, along with all its equipment and experienced officers, was a blow from which the Wehrmacht never fully recovered. More importantly, it shattered the myth of German invincibility that had terrorized Europe for years. The Battle of Stalingrad offers several important lessons that go beyond military strategy. First, it showed the dangers of political leaders making military decisions based on propaganda value rather than strategic sense. Hitler's insistence on capturing a city simply because of its name cost Germany an entire army. Second, it demonstrated the importance of logistics in modern warfare. All the brave soldiers and superior equipment in the world mean nothing if you can't keep them supplied. The German supply crisis was as responsible for their defeat as any Soviet bullet. Third, it proved that underestimating an enemy's will to fight is a fatal mistake. The Germans expected the Soviets to collapse under pressure, but instead found themselves facing an opponent willing to pay any price to defend their homeland. Finally, Stalingrad showed that in total war, civilian populations become both targets and weapons. The Soviet use of civilians in the defense and the German willingness to target them represented a new level of brutality that would characterize warfare for decades to come. Today, more than 80 years later, the Battle of Stalingrad remains one of history's most studied military engagements. It represents the collision of two totalitarian systems, each willing to sacrifice millions of lives for their vision of the future. The battle also serves as a reminder of the human cost of war. Behind all the strategic analysis and tactical discussions were real people. Soldiers who froze to death in trenches, civilians who died in bombing raids, and families who lost loved ones they would never see again. In Russia, Stalingrad, now called Volgograd once again, is remembered as the site of one of the greatest victories in Russian history. Monuments and museums commemorate the sacrifice of those who died defending the city, and the battle remains a source of national pride. In Germany, Stalingrad is remembered differently, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind obedience to authority and the terrible cost of aggressive war. The battle serves as a reminder of where unchecked militarism and racial hatred can lead. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than just a military engagement. It was a turning point in human history. It marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's downfall and the Soviet Union's rise as a superpower. It showed the world that the seemingly unstoppable German war machine could be defeated, and it demonstrated the terrible price of total war. The men who fought and died in Stalingrad's ruins, German and Soviet alike, paid the ultimate price for the ambitions of their leaders. Their sacrifice reminds us that behind every historical event are real human beings whose lives were forever changed by forces beyond their control. Perhaps most importantly, Stalingrad teaches us that wars started by dictators and demagogues are ultimately paid for by ordinary people who never wanted to fight in the first place. It's a lesson that remains relevant today, as conflicts around the world continue to claim innocent lives. The Battle of Stalingrad ended on February 2, 1943, but its echoes can still be heard today. In every discussion about the limits of military power, in every debate about the cost of war, and in every reminder that even the mightiest armies can be defeated by people fighting for their homes and freedom. And there you have it, the incredible, brutal, and ultimately world-changing story of the Battle of Stalingrad. If this deep dive into one of history's most significant battles got your heart racing, make sure to give this video a massive thumbs up. Your likes tell us you want more epic historical content like this. And hey, if you're hungry for more amazing stories from the past, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got tons more incredible historical tales coming your way. From ancient battles to modern conflicts, we're here to bring history to life in ways that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Share this video with your history-loving friends And let's build a community of people who are passionate about understanding our past. Until next time, keep exploring the amazing stories that shaped our world.